All right. Hi, everyone. The moment I'm sure you've been eagerly awaiting. We're going to kick off our very first project. This is Relational Rails. It's linked in the calendar if you'd like to follow along, but I will share my screen to be sure we're all looking at the same stuff. This is a paired project, and I will post the pairs who your project partners will be in Slack shortly after the kickoff today, before I sign off for the afternoon. And depending, I haven't looked at it yet, but depending upon, the number of people, there might be a team of 3 here or there. Cool. But let's jump into it. So for the learning goals for Relational Rails, there's a few points here to keep in mind. The first one is to design a one-to-many relationship using a schema designer. There's a link I need to show for that. But I guess before I get into these each specifically, what I'll mention is some of this stuff that I'm covering today might not sound very familiar, or you might not have the information you need yet to really build out that functionality or understand what we're asking. But as I'm sure many of you have started to pick up on, at Turing, we like to get you started on a project and get you started on an assignment before we've given you all the material to implement what you'll need, before we've given you all the material to build what we're asking you to build. And the goal of this is to encourage you all to get out and explore, and also be thinking about questions in the context of your project as you absorb the material that we are teaching during class. So if some of this doesn't make sense yet, that's okay. I think it will begin to make more and more sense as the week goes on. And the other thing I'll say before I dig into these is that this project is not due until Thursday of week 2, or I guess the evening of Wednesday of week 2, and project evals will be on Thursday. So you do have a pretty significant amount of time between now and then to not only absorb the material, but also implement it in your own project. There will be 2 days for project check-ins. One of them will be this Thursday afternoon. That link will be coming soon as well, like I mentioned earlier, and we'll be sure to post in Slack when that sign up link is available for you all. And then there will be another round of project check-ins on Monday and Tuesday afternoon. This will be the same check-in, so you will only sign up for one of these 2 days in week 2, but total, your pair should get 2 project check-ins with one of us for this project. So on to the learning goals. The first piece here is design a one-to-many relationship using a schema designer. We'll be talking about one-to-many relationships and associations later on in the week. And there is a lesson plan on the calendar for homework this evening that will help you make good decisions when designing your database. The tool that we're asking you to use, the Visual Schema Designer, is also linked in this section of the project spec, this database design site to design your database. So this is the tool that you'll be using. It's linked there, so you don't need to go find it. Yeah. Another learning goal will be to write migrations to create tables with columns of varying data types and foreign keys. So foreign keys is a term that has to do with the relationship that I mentioned in this first bullet point. Migrations are what we use in Rails to make changes to our database. So it's a special command that will run, and it will basically execute a script to change the way that our database is structured. And we have a lesson upcoming on this as well. The third learning goal is to use Rails to create web pages that allow users to create, read, update, and delete resources. So you should already have some familiarity with CRUD from Task Manager. So if you think back to what you built, you should be able to create tasks. You should be able to read a task by seeing it on your page, update it by changing the description or something like that, and then also delete the task. So there will be more of this type of behavior that you'll be building in Relational Rails. Create instance and class methods on a Rails model that uses active record methods and helpers. So this is where we're getting into some data retrieval, data manipulation, some custom instance and class methods, and then testing those, writing model and feature tests that fully cover the logic and user behavior. And as I mentioned, we'll have a feature test lesson coming up, I think on Wednesday. So those are the main learning goals. Some requirements to keep in mind. Actually, I believe this should be Rails 5.2.5. Could have sworn I updated that, but the version of Rails we had you install in the pre-work is the one you're going to want to use. Definitely not Rails 6 or anything below Rails 5.2. Must use Postgres throughout Mod 2. The only database management system we'll be using is PostgreSQL, so you should be all set with that already. And then the third requirement here is that we're asking you to hand roll all routes in the routes file, no use of the resources syntax. So this is something, if you're doing your own research in like the documentation and stuff like that, you might come across a syntax for the routes.rb file that uses a keyword resources, but we'll have a lesson that involves routing that will go through the way to hand roll these. And essentially the reason we're asking you to do that instead of this kind of this shortcut or this syntactic sugar that we have in Rails is because hand rolling the routes paints a clearer picture of what the routes are doing. And we think that's better for people who are new to Rails or building in Rails apps. There may be some gems mentioned in this project page that you can use, but if there's something else that you want to add, just shoot us a DM first to be sure that that is okay for the project. Here's a rubric that we'll be grading the project against. We have this is similar to the one that I showed earlier in the mod intro. There's a feature completeness section, a Rails section where we'll be looking at how you use model view controller design patterns. Database design is another piece that's in this rubric that isn't in all the rubrics. Essentially, we want to be sure that everybody has a clear schema design. It's thought out very well. Your relationships look good. You have a good understanding of what a one-to-many relationship implies. So that's another category. There's an active record category and a testing and debugging category, which I think are relatively straightforward once you get into it. Yes, so I will talk a little bit about what we're expecting as far as the relationships and more about this homework that we're asking you all to do, but does anybody have questions so far? Cool. If any come up, just raise your hand. I'll get to you as soon as I can. So the homework article or the homework lesson plan that I mentioned, it's here on the calendar. So this should provide you with a lot of good information about one-to-many relationships. It'll help you understand what we mean when we say primary key and foreign key. There will be some vocabulary in here such as one-to-many, which I've already used a bunch of times. This is a really great lesson plan. And what I would really recommend is maybe even sitting down with your project partner and doing, like a DTR, basically setting any expectations for working together over the next couple of weeks, and then maybe even reviewing this lesson plan together if that's something you'd both like to do, reading through the lesson plan and thinking about what that means for your database. And essentially what we're asking you to do for your database is for each person on the team to come up with their own one-to-many relationship. And that means that each of you will be thinking of a combination of two tables. So this should represent a real world example of your choice. You get to decide what this is about. And your two tables and your project partner's two tables don't necessarily need to have anything to do with each other. You can make them somewhat related, but they don't need to be. It's totally up to you. So an example would be shelters and pets. That's a one-to-many relationship. A shelter has many pets, and a pet can belong to one shelter. Any pet can belong to one shelter. We're asking that you do not literally use the words parent and child as your relationship. We're using this kind of as keywords to indicate which table we're talking about in the user stories. But for instance, if I was building this out and I had shelters and pets as my relationship, shelter would be the many part of that, shelter would be the one part of that relationship or the parent, and then pets would be the many or the child. So yeah, you can use anything except shelters and pets and parent and child. We are happy to provide feedback on these relationships. So once you have created a diagram for your two tables and your project partner's two tables, you can feel free to send this to both of us in a Slack DM. And if there's anything that we would recommend changing, we'll let you know. We will be reviewing the database design. This diagram here, your version of it, we'll review that in the first project check-in on Thursday. So here's an example. Let's say that Kelly and I are working on this and I have shelters and pets. And then Kelly decided, yeah, I want to create two tables that have a one-to-many relationship that maybe just to humans that would kind of go with shelters and pets. Well, that could be veterinary offices and veterinarians, right? So these two tables are related that I'm moving my cursor over. And then these two tables are related to each other. Like these two separate relationships don't need to have anything to do with each other though. You could do, I've seen people do like breweries and beers, and then tea houses and teas. So then the project was all about beverages, or maybe like, I don't know, like realtors and houses, and then somebody else does something totally different, like beaches and surf shop rentals or something like that, you know. So these are up to you to decide what you want them to be. We do have some guidelines about what columns are included on these tables though. So these are listed here. Happy to clarify in any of this, but it is here for your reference if you need a reminder later on. So you can create as many columns on each table as you'd like, but we do need you to include the following. One string column for name on each of these. So this isn't a great example. Oh wait, yes, they all do have a name, never mind. So yeah, you see how each one of these tables has a string column for name. One Boolean column of your choosing, so a true or false on every table. One numeric column on every table. And then you want to include the created at and the updated at columns on every table as well. This says date time. There might be, when you get through the migrations lesson and have that all set up, it might not be the exact date time data type. If it's like a timestamp data type or something very similar, that's perfectly okay. The idea is we just want to use the built-in timestamps that come with our Rails migrations. So be sure to include those on all your tables when you do run those migrations. And we're having lessons and content on migrations and how to add these columns and all that stuff. So I'd encourage you all to not worry too much about the how just yet. Just be aware that these are the requirements and this is where you find the requirements in the project page. A couple of things to keep in mind is that foreign keys don't count as an integer column. So in the shelters and pets example, the foreign key on the pets table is shelter ID. It references a shelter. And this is an integer, but we are asking you to add an additional integer column. So in this case, the integer column is the age of the pet. You should not create columns that duplicate data. For example, in pets and shelters, a shelter should not store a pet count column, since the count of pets can also be found by counting the number of pets through the association. So yeah, that would be one thing that we would look for if you're DMing us your schema diagram for feedback. We would be looking for columns that might duplicate information. So I'm trying to think of what an example would be for veterinary offices. Yeah, like you wouldn't want to have a column here for veterinarian count, because in Rails, that's actually something we can do without storing that data in the database. We can just say veterinary office.veterinarians.count. That behavior is built in, so we don't want to include it on a table. Yeah, I won't say much more about that. I think that will become more clear as you work through the lesson material as well this week. And like I said, this schema that you're putting together, that design will be reviewed at our first check-in. So you can message us for extra feedback before Thursday. But if you are confident in that and you want to just keep going, that's fine too. We'll just double check it, or we'll check it regardless on Thursday during our project check-in. What questions are coming up so far before I move on? Yeah, Brian.
I'll hold off on it. I'll wait to see if you cover it, sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem. Okay, in that case, okay, go ahead, Dane.
Sorry. As far as the columns go, is this so those one string, one Boolean, one numeric, 2 date time, that's like the minimum, but we can do different things beyond
Correct.
those, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
You can add as many as you want, as long as you include these.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so moving on to user stories. Again, if any questions come up, raise your hand, I will pause. User stories. So in these stories, we will refer to the one side of the relationship as the parent and the many side as the child or children, which is what I mentioned earlier. User stories we'll talk about in more detail in a lesson, but essentially this is a way of us describing the behavior that we're asking you to build. The user stories will also come in handy in feature testing, so maybe just log that away for later. We'll have a lesson about it. Basically, this is everything that you need to build will be in a user story after you have your relationships and migrations and all that data stuff set up. The actual behavior, the CRUD functionality, etc., will all be part of the user stories. So let's see, we talked about this. Children can be associated to the parent. Children belong to a parent. And anywhere you see something in the user stories like child table name, think about, you can equate that to the pets from our pets and shelters example. Anywhere you see like parent table name, you would think of shelters. So those are a couple of examples to keep in mind. And then of course, your relationships will be different. Just remember that the parent is the many and the child, or sorry, the parent is the one and the many is the child. Yeah. So all of these user stories will focus on one of these three things. Active record, I've mentioned and talked about a lot already. CRUD functionality, we know what that is. And then usability. So this has to do with users being able to navigate your site easily and understand what's going on. So this is stuff like adding links and buttons to parts of the site and making sure that the styling and layout is sensible. We don't really have any styling expectations or requirements, but the usability stories will have to do with just basically the very bare bones visuals of what a user would see when they go to your site. So every user story will have to do with one of these three things. In iteration one, oh, go ahead, Brian.
I think that's a good spot for the question. Are you okay with if we use Bootstrap for any CSS?
That's fine with me. What I would advise is to time box any styling that you do with or without Bootstrap, just because it's not really the primary learning goal of the project. But if you want to add in Bootstrap, I think that's a fine gem to use. Cool. So in iteration one, we're starting out with some CRUD stories, basically just creating an index for the parent. And anywhere you see the X2 in a user story, that means that it needs to be built out on both project partners' relationships. So if I have a coffee shops and coffee relationship, and then my project partner has like a national parks and campsites, we would each need to build an index for, mine would be coffee shops and theirs would be national parks. When I, for each parent table as a visitor, when I visit this, visit /parents, and I see the name of each parent record in the system. So these user stories will follow a similar format. It'll say, as a visitor, usually we aren't gonna have any different types of users in mod 2, but basically saying, hey, I'm someone, I'm going to this area of the site, I'm doing some behavior, and then this is what I expect to happen. So I won't go through all of these user stories. I'll let you review those on your own time, but I'll highlight like kind of a couple of differences in the types of user stories. So here we have some that have to do with active record. So this doesn't necessarily have to do with creating, reading, updating, or deleting records. It has to do with some additional logic that we can create using active records. So this is saying now when I visit the parent index, I should see that the records are ordered by most recently created first. And next to each of the records, I see when it was created. So here we're starting to utilize that created at column that we asked for in the database design. And then here's an example of a usability story. As a visitor, when I visit any page on the site, I see a link at the top of the page that takes me to the child index. So a little bit of an idea of what to expect there. And then after user story 10, that's the end of iteration 1, and that's what we'll be reviewing at the second project check-in in week 2. So I won't go through all these user stories because that would take the whole afternoon, maybe. But I think these are good for you all to review as a team. And then we do have some extensions here. If you get through all of that work and want to go above and beyond, we have a few extension stories. But really, that is about it. Yeah, I'll open it up for questions again. Antonio?
Yeah, so how does this work in terms of, I guess historically, whenever we do projects as a group, everything gets pushed to GitHub and, you know, merged and improved and all that stuff. Are we doing that? I guess it's not specifically called out, but is that?
Yep, good question. And yes, it will. You all will be collaborating on GitHub, meaning one person will be the owner of the repo. Ideally, you'll be checking out branches to complete your work, pushing those up and opening a pull request for your project partner to review, at which point, if everything's good, it can get merged into main. So yeah, I would follow that whole process, and you can essentially assume, well, there's this project and then there's the group project, and the expectation will be the same. We'll be adding on a few more project management type of tools in the next project, but right now, yeah, just keep doing what you've been doing. It sounds like you've been working collaboratively on GitHub and determining who will own the repo and all that good stuff already, right? So.
Okay, is it encouraged? I mean, for a paired project, I guess, would you recommend we still do driver navigator, or can we choose to work on features? I mean,
yeah, another good question. And I think that's really up to you and your project partner. I think, you know, we're always going to lean towards encouraging you to collaborate as much as possible, but that doesn't necessarily have to be driver navigator. Definitely depends upon how you work best. And a lot of these user stories are mirrored, right? Like you're going to be implementing the same user story on each side of the relationship. So maybe you could work in parallel. Maybe you could take some time to work independently and then review each other's code. Maybe you can do driver navigator. Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to talk about in your DTR once I send out the project pairs, but there's no specific expectation. We probably will be looking at your Git history just to kind of see what that workflow has looked like as far as version control and reviewing pull requests and stuff like that. But yeah, no specific requirements on how you collaborate.
okay, and then the user stories. So you're saying that they don't actually have to be the same code for, you know, like if we come up with a different version of the code, it doesn't have to like match the user stories like exactly.
So you and your project partner, for instance, let's take this child index. You all don't have to implement user story 3 the exact same way. Although there may be opportunities to dry up your code that you would notice if you were working more closely together, right? So yeah, that we don't necessarily expect that you are using the same exact set of code to get the results that you're looking for. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Marla?
Yeah, so with Task Manager over the intermission, I tried working with GitHub a little bit, and it seemed to be like a lot of extra stuff that was like files and stuff that were wanting to be committed that I didn't really like. Is there anything, I guess the question is there anything that we need to look at specifically when working with Rails in GitHub, or like a resource that we can look at to help with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There will definitely be things that you will want to add to your Git ignore. Oh man, I'm trying to remember if we have that listed out anywhere. Maybe in Task Manager. No. If I find like a resource or something that points out like the common things to include in a Git ignore, I'll send it your way. I'll put it in the code help channel. But I think it kind of depends upon what you're seeing, because there are just a lot more files and folders and things in Rails that in some cases do need to be committed. Like, for example, you want your gem file committed because you want everybody should be bundling the same version of the same gems, right? But there are also probably some things like you want your coverage folder in the Git ignore, for example. You don't want to be committing the coverage index.html, for instance. Yeah, I would say if that comes up again and you're seeing files that you're not sure, that'd be a good thing to post in code help and have a follow-up conversation about. Is that helpful? Any follow-up on
Yeah.
that?
I guess just when I get there,
Yeah.
I'll reach out about it. Yeah, because there seemed like there was, and I don't know if it's because it seemed like there was a lot that I didn't necessarily know what each folder or file was related to. So I couldn't tell what, I didn't know enough to be able to say like, oh, I can commit this, or I don't have to commit that. Or so it was just a little, a lot to go process. But yeah, once we start this, I'll reach out if that happens again.
Gotcha. Yeah, sounds good. And that all sounds right to me. And I think the other thing I'll mention is when you're first running Rails new, like when you're first creating a brand new repo, there'll just be a ton of stuff, just so much that gets committed. So I think maybe what you were seeing is expected, but if something seems a little bit code smelly, then I'm happy to take a closer look at a specific example. What other questions do y'all have? Okay. Cool. Well, that's all I have on the project kickoff side. I do need to go create your pairs and send those out. So keep an eye on the 2105 backend cohort channel for that. But other than that, if questions come up, feel free to reach out to us. And the rest of the day we have work time. So we will see you all in the morning for the intro to databases and ORMs. And yeah, thank you for your time. I know it's been a big day. See you all later.
Thank you.